If you drop a jagged, irritating grain of sand into an oyster, well, the oyster doesn't just sit there and tolerate the pain.
Right, it doesn't just ignore the intrusion.
Exactly. And it doesn't destroy itself trying to expel it either. Instead, it involuntarily goes to work. It secretes these layers of calcium carbonate and conculin, smoothing over the damage, metabolizing the intrusion over time.
Until it creates a pearl.
Yeah, until it creates a pearl. And today, we are looking at how the human mind does the exact same thing. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone.
It really is the ultimate psychological alchemy, isn't it? And, it cuts right to the heart of a question that haunts almost every clinical encounter, every diagnostic manual, and frankly, every individual's private self-reflection.
Which is, what does it actually mean to be normal?
Exactly. What is normal?
So for those of you listening, especially, psychiatry trainees, registrars, and clinicians, you know that defining normality is deceptively difficult. It's the structural spine of our deep dive today.
We're walking alongside the foundational framework laid out by Dr. Georgie Vaillant regarding normality and mental health.
Right, so consider this a companion piece to your clinical reading. Our mission here is to build mental models and really put some pressure on your clinical reasoning.
To set the baseline for this, we have to frame what psychiatry actually is at its core. Because it is far too easy to slip into the assumption that psychiatry is merely the categorization of illness.
Which it absolutely is not.
No, not at all. Psychiatry is the study of how the brain, the mind, and experience interact. It's the study of how that highly integrated process can go wrong, sure. But equally, it is the study of how that process succeeds, adapts, and triumphs.
Let's ground that with an image right straight away. Think about a decathlon champion. If I ask you, what makes a world-class track star?
Is it sheer, explosive physical strength?
Right. Or is it blinding speed off the blocks? Or maybe endurance? Or just raw competitive grit?
The definition of athletic excellence varies wildly depending on the specific event or the cultural era.
Exactly. But a high score in the decathlon, well, that can raise athletic excellence absolutely anywhere in the world. Why? Because it demands a dynamic, integrated balance.
Yeah, no single metric defines the decathlete. It's the integration of multiple, sometimes competing strengths that creates this universally recognized state of excellence.
And bioethicist Leon Kass captures this beautifully with what we might call the healthy squirrel metaphor.
Oh, I love this one. Kass poses a simple question. What is a healthy squirrel?
Right.
It is certainly not just a squirrel with normal blood pressure, normal serum calcium, and a clean digestive tract. You just cannot define its health merely by pointing to a stack of unremarkable lab results.
Or just the absence of a limp, right?
Spot on. A healthy squirrel is a bushy-tailed fellow who leaps through the canopy with tremendous daring. He forages with cunning. He acts with a vital spiritedness.
And he shows intense prudence when a predator is near. He is fully, dynamically alive in his specific environment.
Precisely. Health is an active, dynamic state of being. It reveals itself in activity, in engagement with the world. It's a presence, not an absence.
And that is the philosophical shift we have to make right now for this deep dive.
We have to violently move away from defining mental health simply as the absence of pathology.
Okay, wait. I need to push back on this early on, because the immediate reaction from anyone who has taken a standard statistics class is going to be, well, isn't normal just safely occupying the middle of the statistical bell curve?
Right, the old standard deviation argument.
Yeah, if your traits fall within one standard deviation of the mean, you are average and therefore biologically and psychologically normal.
It is the most common assumption, and it is a remarkably poor proxy for health. Average is essentially a statistical illusion when applied to optimal biological functioning.
How so?
Well, look at the general population. The average eyesight in most modern populations requires corrective lenses to function properly.
Right, that's true.
And the average weight in many Western populations today is clinically morbid and places intense strain on the cardiovascular system. Average dentition includes cavities and decay.
So when we rely on statistical averages to define normality, we are fatally mixing the truly healthy individuals with the highly prevalent amount of pathology that just happens to exist in that population.
Exactly.
So the middle of the bell curve is just a mathematical compromise. It isn't a safe zone at all.
Far from it. Now, sometimes health does reside right in the middle, like with red blood cell count or core body temperature. But in many critical domains, health is found strictly at the extreme upper end of the curve.
Like what?
Consider exercise tolerance, empathy, or cognitive processing speed. An average IQ is 100, but an IQ of 130 is considered superior.
Right. We don't pathologize an IQ of 130 just because it sits 2 standard deviations away from the norm.
No, we celebrate it. And conversely, health is often found at the extreme low end of the statistical curve. Think about serum cholesterol, bilirubin levels, or traits like narcissism and impulsivity.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so being average in your level of narcissism might actually mean you possess a highly disruptive level of narcissism.
Which immediately complicates the diagnostic process.
Yeah.
If we cannot rely on a statistical average, we are forced to look at a second massive variable. Context. Geography, culture, historical era.
It really seems like the environment entirely dictates the utility and therefore the health of a biological or psychological trait.
Context is the absolute sovereign in both biology and psychology. The classic biological example is the sickle cell trait.
Right, the malaria connection.
Yeah, so if you live in a modern metropolis like London or New York, the sickling of red blood cells is a pathological condition. It causes vascular occlusion, pain crises, organ damage. It is a profound liability.
But transport that exact same genetic presentation to a tropical region where Plasmodium falciparum malaria is highly endemic, and that trait becomes life-saving.
Exactly. The heterozygote advantage provides crucial resistance to a deadly pathogen. The gene doesn't change at all, the environment did.
And that scales right up to complex psychological and cultural norms, doesn't it? Take a concept as simple as punctuality.
Oh, brilliant example.
In Germany or Switzerland, arriving perfectly on time is a core virtue. It signals reliability, respect, and psychological stability.
But in certain parts of Brazil or the Mediterranean, arriving exactly on the hour for a social gathering might be interpreted as rigidly anxious, socially inflexible, or, frankly, just rude.
It's fascinating to consider that some Aboriginal Australian languages don't even possess a conceptual vocabulary for linear time in the way Westerners use it.
Right, so you can't diagnose a time management deficit in a culture that doesn't measure worth by the clock.
Which brings us to the historical dimension of context.
Patton is a brilliant case study here.
Yeah, Patton possessed a hyper-competitive, deeply aggressive, and volatile temperament.
And during the interwar peacetime years, that psychological makeup was a massive liability. It alienated his peers, got him into constant disciplinary and diplomatic trouble.
But in the context of commanding armored divisions across Europe in a world war, that exact same relentless, aggressive temperament was a profound, world-altering asset.
There's another brilliant example regarding World War II submariners. If you take individuals with deeply paranoid, hypervigilant personality traits, they make absolutely terrible submariners.
I can imagine. Being trapped in a claustrophobic metal tube underwater with 100 other men while experiencing intense interpersonal suspicion, that's a recipe for catastrophic breakdown.
But take those same hypervigilant, paranoid individuals and make them airplane spotters on the coast of England. They were unparalleled.
They were relentlessly scanning the horizon, trusting no shadow, assuming every speck was a threat. Their paranoia was weaponized into a life-saving adaptation for the collective.
This specific dynamic forces the clinician to confront a crucial distinction in the assessment room. And this is vital. It's the difference between a trait and a state.
If you cannot differentiate these two, your clinical reasoning will collapse.
It absolutely will.
Let's bring this directly into the clinical setting then. If I'm doing a standard 50-minute psychiatric intake, how do I practically differentiate between the two?
Well, consider a physical analogy first. Who is healthier, an Olympic miler who is temporarily disabled by a severely sprained ankle, or a patient with lifelong type 1 diabetes who currently presents with perfectly normal blood sugar levels because they just administered insulin?
Okay, the Olympic miler has a temporary condition. The sprained ankle is a state. It will heal, and the baseline exceptional health will return.
Right.
While the diabetic patient has a permanent underlying physiological condition, a trait. Even if their current state, their current blood test looks completely normal.
Correct. Now map that onto an intake evaluation, particularly cross-culturally. A Western clinician might observe an ascetic mystic in a deep, prolonged state of meditative trance.
Superficially, cross-sectionally, the individual is unresponsive to external stimuli, maintaining rigid posture, maybe uttering seemingly nonsensical phrases.
And the immediate clinical reflex might be to suspect a catatonic state or a psychotic break.
But that is a temporary state induced for a highly specific cultural spiritual purpose. It is not an enduring neurobiological trait.
Exactly. If you track that individual longitudinally, you will see them exit the state and resume complex, adaptive social functioning. The pathology only exists if you mistake the transient state for the permanent trait.
Which introduces perhaps the most dangerous trap in defining mental health, what Dr. Vaillant and others refer to as contamination by
Well,
values.
this is the big one.
It is incredibly easy to confuse what a specific society currently applauds with objective biological health.
It is the ultimate blind spot of cultural anthropology. Just because a culture tolerates or even celebrates a specific behavior does not miraculously render that behavior biologically or psychologically sound.
Look at the historical attitude towards alcohol in certain European cultures.
Yes, for a significant period, Portuguese culture did not conceptualize heavy daily alcohol consumption as an illness or pathology. It was a deeply ingrained, normalized social practice.
However, that societal value judgment did not halt the sheer biological devastation. The cirrhosis, the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, the premature mortality that ravaged Lisbon.
Because biology does not care about sociology.
And we must strictly separate the concept of effectiveness from mental health. There is a striking historical comparison used to illustrate this point clinically in the text.
It's a very challenging but necessary comparison.
Right. If we look at political leadership purely through the utilitarian lens of rallying a fractured nation, rebuilding an economy, and consolidating absolute power, Adolf Hitler was undeniably a more effective leader of his country during the 1930s than Jimmy Carter was of the United States in the late 1970s.
However, through any objective psychiatric metric, Carter possessed vastly superior mental health.
What is valued by a populace in a moment of crisis, or what is effective for gaining brutal leverage, is absolutely not synonymous with what constitutes a healthy, resilient, and functioning human mind.
And that is the immovable anchor here. Biology trumps anthropology. True health is the activity of a living organism in accordance with its specific, inherent biological excellences. It operates independently of whether the local culture happens to applaud those excellences at any given moment.
So if we strip away the statistical average, and we strip away the shifting sands of cultural values, what are we left with? How do we empirically measure a healthy mind?
It is a profoundly humbling reality that human science managed to map the highly complex, invisible building blocks of nuclear fission decades before it managed to map the empirical building blocks of positive mental health.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. For a long time, the psychiatric establishment basically agreed with Freud, who rather cynically dismissed the concept of mental health as an ideal fiction. But over the last half-century, robust, overlapping empirical models have finally emerged. We're going to look at 8 of them.
One of the earliest shifts was moving away from the military draft board's old 1A standard.
Right. Model A, mental health as above normal.
During World War II, the military assessed psychological fitness almost entirely by the absence of psychosomatic symptoms. If a recruit didn't have active stomach ulcers, profound enuresis, or crippling panic attacks, they were stamped normal.
But contemporary models argue that mental health must be defined as explicitly above normal. It's not just the absence of negatives.
The clearest manifestation of this paradigm shift was the psychological selection process for the Mercury astronauts in the late 1950s.
The space program wasn't looking for men who were merely not sick. They were looking for men who possessed an extreme, almost anomalous level of positive mental health.
Because the stressors they were going to face were unprecedented in human history. So what did that actually look like in the testing data? How do you measure extreme health?
The data was staggering. Demographically, they came from highly stable, intact family structures and possessed a history of exemplary, sustained work performance. But the physiological and psychological stress testing revealed the true mechanism.
Tell them about the pressure suit.
Right. So when subjected to severe, terrifying stressors, such as being placed in a poorly functioning pressure suit in a thermal chamber, simulating an altitude of 65,000 feet.
Absolute nightmare scenario.
Literally. Their cognitive and motor performance did not merely hold steady, it actually improved.
They didn't just endure the terror, they metabolized it into hyperfocus.
Exactly. Furthermore, when assessed using the Maudsley Personality Inventory, their group neuroticism scores were the lowest of any cohort ever reported in the psychological literature up to that point.
Wow.
They demonstrated an astonishing capacity to tolerate extreme isolation. They possessed a deep, inherent trust in their peers. And crucially, they rarely dwelt on their own internal emotional turmoil. yet they remained acutely sensitive and aware of the emotional states of those around them.
They were highly calibrated instruments.
They really were.
We see this conceptualized today in clinical practice through the Global Assessment of Functioning, or the GAF scale. To bring this to life, let's look at two longitudinal case studies from the text, Alfred Payne and Richard Luckey.
Yeah, so if you evaluate Alfred, he scores a GAF of 72. In clinical terms, that is firmly average. He never required psychiatric hospitalization. He held a job. He functioned.
But subjectively, he was chronically dissatisfied, socially isolated, and lived a life of quiet attrition.
Now contrast Alfred with Richard Luckey, who, over his lifetime, maintained a GAF of 95. Richard was not merely surviving. He was highly generative.
He painted landscapes, he sang tenor in his local choir, he maintained deep, vital connections with his extended family, and he actively sought out and mastered complex new technologies well into his 70s.
Both of these men technically lacked a DSM diagnosis. Neither was ill, but one was vastly objectively healthier and more alive than the other.
Which flows perfectly into Model B, the domain of positive psychology, heavily championed by researchers like Martin Seligman.
Right, because the traditional medical model is inherently deficit-based. It is focused on removing pathology, excising the tumor, resetting the fractured bone, lowering the dopamine to stop the hallucination.
But the positive psychology model argues that health is about actively fostering human strengths, curiosity, enthusiasm, and joy.
The neurobiological mechanism here is vital to understand. We used to view cognition and mood as somewhat separate from the hardwiring of the brain. But we now know that altered cognition literally alters brain function and neurochemistry. Positive psychology examines how learned helplessness, the cognitive belief that your actions have no impact on your suffering, rapidly leads to clinical depression and immune suppression.
Conversely, learned optimism and self-efficacy lead directly to robust mental and physical health.
And the clinical data on optimism is genuinely wild. In trials treating major depressive disorder, the placebo effect accounts for roughly 50% of the variance in outcomes between patients treated with SSRIs and those receiving no treatment at all.
Let's pause and unpack the mechanism of that, because it isn't magic.
It's biology.
Right. When a severely depressed patient is handed a pill, and they believe that pill is going to alleviate their suffering, the psychological introduction of hope activates the brain's reward circuitry.
It alters dopamine and serotonin transmission. It reduces the hyperreactivity of the HPA axis, lowering toxic cortisol levels.
The cognitive state of optimism is literally physically altering their neurochemistry enough to account for half of the clinical improvement seen with powerful medications.
It's incredible. And healthy optimism isn't just blind, Pollyanna-ish happy thinking. It requires a specific attributional style.
Right. A healthy mind views positive events as lasting and pervasive, like, I succeeded because I am generally capable.
And it views negative events as temporary and specific. I failed this test because I didn't study this specific chapter enough.
This connects deeply to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow. Early psychoanalysis, particularly Freud, placed immense emphasis on libido, this primal, biological, instinctual drive for tension reduction.
You have an itch, you scratch it. You have a biological urge, you satisfy it. But flow is an entirely different mechanism of health.
Flow is that state of total, frictionless absorption. It occurs when a task is perfectly calibrated. It is highly challenging, but it exactly matches your high level of skill.
You have clear goals, immediate feedback, and time seems to completely vanish.
You actually lose your meta-awareness, your sense of self, because all your cognitive resources are deeply invested in the present moment. That is not tension reduction. That is active, engaged health.
Absolutely. So if positive psychology shows us that the mind can actively foster joy, the natural question for a clinician is, does our capacity for this engagement change as we age?
Which brings us to Model C, mental health as a function of maturity.
Unlike our kidneys or our lungs, which generally reach peak biological efficiency in our 20s and then begin a slow, inevitable decline, the human brain is entirely exceptional.
The brain continues to develop functionally into our 8th decade.
And anatomically, the process of myelinization, that's the wrapping of our neural pathways in an insulating sheath of myelin, which makes electrical transmission vastly faster and more efficient. That process continues well into our 6th decade.
Meaning a 60-year-old brain is physically, anatomically different and potentially far more efficient at processing highly complex, ambiguous socio-emotional data than a 25-year-old brain.
Adult development is not a downward staircase toward senility. Eric Erickson conceptualized this lifelong maturation process as the widening social radius. As a healthy individual matures, their sphere of psychological concern must expand outward.
Clinically, this manifests in Erickson's developmental stages. Consider the task of generativity, which typically occupies the ages of 35 to 55.
This is the crucial developmental capacity to care for the next generation. It requires a psychological pivot away from aggressive personal achievement and toward mentoring, guiding, and nurturing others.
Dr. Vaillant describes this phase beautifully. He calls it the task of learning to hold loosely.
Giving away your hard-won expertise without desperately needing to control the outcome or claim the credit.
If an individual fails to achieve this transition, their neural and psychological development stalls. They enter a state of stagnation, becoming self-absorbed and intellectually brittle.
And as we move into the final chapters of life, the ultimate task is integrity versus despair.
Can a patient look back at their one and only life, with all its inherent tragedies, flaws, and missed opportunities, and find a coherent sense of peace and meaning?
Or do they fall into despair over what can no longer be changed? Mental health is inextricably linked to successfully navigating this biological and psychological maturation process.
Okay, we are arriving at what feels like the absolute beating heart of this entire deep dive. Model D mental health as resilience and involuntary coping. Everything we've discussed so far, optimism, maturity, context, it all hinges on this specific mechanism.
This framework is the enduring legacy of the psychiatrist Adolf Meyer. Meyer made a revolutionary, highly controversial assertion at the time. He stated that there are no mental diseases in the traditional sense.
There are only reaction patterns to stress.
Exactly.
Let's translate that using the physical body. If a pathogen enters your lungs, you develop a violent cough, you produce thick mucus, your core temperature spikes into a fever.
Or if you fracture your tibia, the surrounding tissue becomes red, aggressively swollen, and exquisitely tender to the touch.
Right. To a completely alien observer who doesn't understand human biology, the swelling and the fever look exactly like the disease.
But they aren't. The swarming is the body's desperate homeostatic struggle to immobilize the shattered bone so it can fuse back together. The fever is the body cooking the pathogen. The symptom is actually the adaptation.
And Meyer argued that the human mind does the exact same thing. What psychoanalysts traditionally termed defenses and what we now call involuntary mental mechanisms are the psychological equivalents of coughing or swelling.
Yes. When the mind faces sudden, overwhelming stress, trauma, or massive cognitive dissonance, these defenses involuntarily distort our perception of internal or external reality.
They do this to reduce our subjective distress, to stave off paralyzing anxiety, and to prevent total psychological fragmentation. They heal by distorting.
And what exactly are they protecting us from? Well, the framework outlines 4 massive constant sources of psychological stress, termed the 4 lodestars of conflict.
I want everyone listening to think about your own life right now, your own clinical caseload, and map these 4 lodestars. Number 1 is impulse.
This is our raw affect, our biological passion. It is terror, blinding grief, lust, profound dependency. This is the hot, chaotic cognition living deep in our limbic system.
Number 2 is reality. Sudden, unalterable changes in our external environment. A catastrophic car crash, a sudden termination from a lifelong career, or a global exogenous shock like a pandemic.
Number 3 is people. Specifically, those paramount figures in our lives whom we cannot live with, but simultaneously desperately cannot live without.
And crucially, this includes people who are dead. The internalized representations of abusive parents, lost spouses, or estranged children continue to generate massive intrapsychic conflict for decades after they are gone.
And number 4 is social learning. This is our conscience, our cultural taboos, the Freudian superego. It is the deeply ingrained, rigid set of rules we absorb from our parents and our society about what is acceptable and what is deeply shameful.
So we have these 4 lodestars constantly grinding against each other, generating massive internal friction. Impulse wants to scream. Social learning says we must be quiet.
Reality delivers a tragedy. People demand we keep functioning.
The mind deploys involuntary defenses to survive this grinding friction. And there's a very clear clinical hierarchy of these defenses, ranging from deeply pathological to exquisitely mature.
Let's systematically walk through that hierarchy, starting at the bottom. At the most pathological level, we observe the psychotic denial of external reality.
This occurs when the cognitive dissonance is so unfathomably painful that the brain literally hallucinates or constructs impenetrable delusions to rewrite the physical world.
The mind essentially says, if reality is unbearable, I will simply invent a new one. We experience this nightly in our dreams, which is harmless, but when it breaches waking life, it is clinical psychosis.
Moving up one tier, we encounter the immature or narcissistic defenses. This category includes mechanisms like projection.
Right, projection is when your own internal impulse is so unacceptable to your conscience that your brain literally throws it onto someone else. I'm not furiously angry with you. You are constantly angry with me.
It also includes acting out or retreating entirely into a schizoid fantasy world to avoid the terrifying complexity of real people. And what is vital for a clinician to recognize here is that immature defenses generally make the other people in the room incredibly uncomfortable, while the user feels perfectly fine.
Yeah, the patient projecting their rage feels entirely justified and calm. It's their spouse who is suffering the psychological whiplash.
Then we reach the intermediate defenses, often called the neurotic defenses. These include repression, displacement, and reaction formation.
Displacement is the classic scenario. A man is humiliated and berated by his CEO. He cannot express his rage to the CEO without losing his livelihood. Reality colliding with impulse.
So he involuntarily displaces that rage. He goes home and viciously yells at his innocent dog. The effect is preserved, but the target is swapped. How do I tell reaction formation from, say, a mature defense like altruism? They can look similar on the surface.
Oh, that is a phenomenal clinical question. Reaction formation is when the mind takes an utterly unacceptable impulse and forces the individual to act out its exact extreme opposite.
Okay, so a person harboring deep, unacknowledged aggressive impulses might unconsciously transform them into a suffocating, hypervigilant pacifism. They become the ultimate martyr.
But here's the diagnostic key. Intermediate defenses cause the user conscious suffering. The person utilizing reaction formation or severe obsessive compulsions is drained, anxious, and rigid.
They know something is wrong. They feel hollowed out by their own extreme behavior.
Yes, that subjective suffering is why users of intermediate defenses are the most likely to walk into a psychiatrist's office seeking help.
Which brings us to the apex of human psychological development, the mature defenses. These mechanisms are still defenses. They still distort reality or impulse, but they do so with immense grace, flexibility, and utility.
They allow the individual to consciously experience the effective pain of the conflict, but in a tempered, highly manageable way. We really need to deep dive into these because this is the actual practical alchemy of mental health. Let's start with humor.
And to be clear, we are not talking about telling a joke.
No, Freud actually considered mature humor to be the highest of the defensive processes. Humor allows an individual to look directly, unflinchingly, at what is most painful and tragic.
You see the horror, you feel the distress, but you do not act out on it and you do not repress it.
True humor permits the discharge of immense emotional tension without individual discomfort and without alienating the people around you, but it requires exquisite psychological timing.
Right. If a patient uses slapstick or constant sarcasm to look away from their trauma, that is merely dissociation. Mature humor stares straight into the abyss of the tragedy and manages to find the absurd. It connects, it does not deflect.
Next is altruism. This is resolving your own agonizing internal conflict by deriving genuine pleasure from giving to others the exact care you yourself desperately wish to receive. Let's revisit your point about distinguishing this from reaction formation.
Okay, let's think of a patient in recovery from severe alcohol use disorder. If they employ an intermediate defense like reaction formation, they become rigidly, violently opposed to alcohol.
They might actively annoy and alienate all their moderate drinking friends by constantly lecturing them. Driven by their own repressed craving, they are white-knuckling their sobriety.
But if that same patient utilizes the mature defense of altruism, they become a dedicated AA sponsor. They soothe their own unmet needs and metabolize their past trauma by gently guiding someone else through the exact darkness they barely survive.
They feel energized and fulfilled, not drained and rigid.
Then there is suppression, a mechanism that researcher Angela Duckworth has essentially rebranded in modern pop psychology as grit.
Suppression is the Stoic ideal. Crucially, it is not repression. In repression, the brain buries the feeling so deeply you forget it exists.
But in suppression, you keep the painful impulse or the acute desire firmly in your conscious mind, but you exert immense executive control to postpone acting on it. It is the capacity for delayed gratification.
The analogy is a masterfully trimmed sail on a boat. You aren't hiding below deck from the violent wind of your passion. You are standing at the helm, calculating exactly how to harness that dangerous energy to move yourself forward toward a goal.
which is deeply integrated with anticipation. Anticipation is the profound cognitive capacity to keep an effective response to an unbearable future event in mind, but in small, titrated, manageable doses. It is the work of anticipatory mourning.
Imagine a parent whose child has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Anticipation is the agonizing, gradual process of accepting that inevitable future loss, allowing themselves to feel the grief in small waves now, adjusting their internal reality piece by piece.
By doing this terrifying work in advance, when the tragic event finally occurs, their psyche is not completely suddenly shattered by the impact. It is the ultimate emotional preparation.
And finally, perhaps the most beautiful of all the mature defenses, sublimation. This takes us right back to our opening metaphor of the oyster. Sublimation is the transformation of an irritating, painful impulse into a societal pearl. It is psychic alchemy.
The clinical literature often points to Ludwig van Beethoven as the supreme example of sublimation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Here was a man who was profoundly deaf, increasingly isolated, and furiously, violently angry at his tragic fate and the people around him. He possessed massive aggressive impulses.
But he didn't act out violently. He didn't project his rage into paranoia. He involuntarily channeled all of that chaotic, destructive limbic energy into the highly structured, mathematically precise creation of the Ode to Joy in his Ninth Symphony.
Sublimation turns our darkest, most unacceptable conflicts into art, into scientific discovery, into profound societal contributions.
And the sobering reality for any clinician listening is that you cannot simply prescribe these defenses. They are entirely involuntary. You cannot instruct a traumatized patient, just go home and sublimate your childhood abuse into a best-selling novel.
It requires a highly resilient, mature neural architecture, built up painstakingly over decades of facing conflict, tolerating the friction, and adapting.
That developmental capacity directly underpins Model E socio-emotional intelligence. This is the premise that true mental health is essentially possessing a supremely high emotional IQ.
It demands three concurrent skills: the accurate, nuanced perception of your own internal emotional state, the autonomous ability to self-soothe your own anxiety without demanding the environment change for you, and the capacity to accurately read and respond to the complex emotional states of others.
Aristotle articulated this mechanism flawlessly thousands of years ago in the Nicomachean Ethics. He observed that anyone can become angry. That is a mere limbic reflex. It is easy.
But to be angry with the right person, to the exact right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is incredibly difficult. That requires the massive executive function and precise calibration of high socio-emotional intelligence.
Let's shift gears slightly to the subjective experience of the patient. Model F, subjective well-being, or SWB. This explores the internal subjective experience of happiness. But we have to draw a very sharp clinical distinction here between simple happiness and profound joy.
The distinction is mechanistic. Happiness is frequently tied to selfish drive reduction. You are intensely hungry, you eat a phenomenal meal, the biological drive is reduced, and you feel happy.
You have an itch, you scratch it. It is often solitary and fleeting.
Joy, however, is fundamentally tied to interpersonal connection, long-term gratification, and deep meaning. You don't feel drive reduction when you watch your child take their first steps. You feel joy.
And how do these emotions actually dictate human behavior? What is their evolutionary purpose?
The evolutionary mechanism is that positive emotions generate behavioral expansion. When an organism experiences joy, trust, or curiosity, it broadens its cognitive repertoire.
It explores its environment, it builds complex social alliances, it seeks out win-win scenarios.
Negative emotions, conversely, drastically constrict cognitive focus. When you experience fear, anger, or acute distress, your brain narrows its parameters. It enters a zero-sum, strictly survivalist mode. You stop exploring and start defending.
But I want to be very careful here not to sound like a toxic positivity seminar. Negative emotions are not inherently unhealthy or pathological. They are vital, life-saving signals.
If you don't feel fear standing near a cliff edge, you die.
Sadness is the necessary, painful psychological protest against a profound loss. It is the signal that summons the community to support you and eventually summons you to find a replacement for what was lost. Anger is the alarm bell signaling that a critical personal boundary has been violently trespassed. You cannot just ignore the negative dashboard lights of your psyche and claim to be healthy.
Precisely. And when we examine subjective well-being over a patient's lifespan, we encounter one of the most robust and sometimes frustrating phenomena in psychology, the hedonic treadmill.
The human central nervous system possesses a staggering capacity for homeostasis. The data on this is always jarring to read. If you track individuals who have suffered catastrophic, life-altering spinal cord injuries resulting in paraplegia, you find that within just a few months of the initial devastation, their subjective well-being often returns to a baseline where their daily positive emotions once again exceed their negative ones.
The mind aggressively adapts to the new physical reality.
Conversely, track individuals who experience a massive euphoric windfall, like winning a multi-million-pound lottery. They experience a staggering spike in euphoria. But within a matter of weeks or months, the novelty metabolizes, and they return almost exactly to their previous mundane baseline of subjective well-being. We are biologically wired to adapt to our circumstances, for better or worse.
We've arrived at the final conceptual model, Model G, and it's one that historically makes a lot of hard science clinicians uncomfortable. Positive or spiritual emotions.
For a very long time, the psychiatric establishment aggressively expunged anything resembling spirituality, awe, or transcendence from its diagnostic textbooks. It was viewed as unscientific mysticism.
But if we connect this to the broader neurobiological picture, the hard science completely validates the existence and necessity of these emotions. We have to ask, where do feelings of profound awe, gratitude, selfless compassion, and deep interpersonal trust actually live in the physical brain?
This is where the neurology becomes incredibly profound. The research points specifically to structures like the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula.
And zooming in even further to a highly specific, late-evolving type of neuron called spindle cells, or von Economo neurons.
If you look at the evolutionary biology, macaques and lower monkeys do not possess them at all. The higher apes, like chimpanzees, possess roughly 7,000 of these specific cells. Human adults, we possess nearly 200,000 of them.
This is a massive evolutionary leap. These spindle cells, uniquely situated in areas routing complex emotional and cognitive data, appear to be the central governors of social emotions and rapid moral judgment. Furthermore, we know that mirror neurons reside densely in these exact same regions.
Explain mirror neurons, because they are the literal mechanism of empathy, right?
Yes. Mirror neurons are cortical cells that fire both when an individual performs a specific action and, remarkably, when they merely observe someone else performing that exact same action.
If I watch you accidentally cut your finger, the motor and pain processing areas of my brain corresponding to that finger light up. We literally biologically simulate the internal state of the other person.
They mediate empathy. This conclusively proves that deep pro-social spiritual emotions like compassion and interconnectedness are not merely flimsy cultural constructs. They are hardwired, anatomically verifiable evolutionary achievements of the human brain.
All right, we have constructed this massive architecture of 8 overlapping models. We understand the biology, the defenses, the context. But the ultimate transition we have to make for our listeners is application. When you are sitting in a consultation room facing a complex, suffering patient, how do you synthesize all of this? How do you actually measure their mental health?
It demands a fundamental, often uncomfortable shift in clinical perspective. You simply cannot evaluate true mental health cross-sectionally.
Right. If a patient presents with a fractured radius, you can diagnose it perfectly in a 10-minute cross-sectional snapshot using an X-ray. You cannot diagnose the health of a human psyche in a single 50-minute intake session. It absolutely requires a longitudinal perspective. You must view the arc of their life over time.
To crystallize why that time dimension is so critical, I want to share a beautiful parable that Dr. Vaillant highlights. It comes from Gotthold Lessing's 18th century play, Nathan the Wise.
In the story, a powerful sultan demands that Nathan, a wise merchant, identify the one true religion. It's a trap. Nathan replies by telling a story about an ancient father who possessed a magic ring. This ring had the secret power to make its owner beloved by both God and man.
But the father had 3 sons, and he loved them all equally. Unable to choose, he secretly had a master craftsman forge 2 perfect replicas. He gave 1 ring to each son, and then he died. The 3 sons, discovering the duplication, go before a judge to demand he declare which is the true ring.
And the judge delivers a profound verdict. He says that the defining characteristic of the true ring is its power to make the wearer loved. Therefore, I cannot tell you today which ring is real. You must each go out and strive to prove the virtue of your ring through a lifetime of gentleness, unselfishness, and profound friendliness.
The virtue of the true ring, the judge declares, will only be proven conclusively among your children's children.
Mental health is that true ring. It cannot be identified by a momentary claim of happiness, a single, clean toxicology screen, or a cheerful demeanor during a morning ward round. It is only revealed over decades, through sustained adaptation to tragedy, the depth and longevity of intimate relationships, and the generative legacy of one's actions.
So, thinking practically like a psychiatrist, how does this alter the actual questions you ask your patient? You must stop relying entirely on cross-sectional data gathering. You do not simply ask, "Are you currently married?" or "What is your present job title?"
Those questions only give you the weather report for today. You must ask longitudinal questions to understand the climate.
Exactly. Instead of asking if they are married, you ask, "Tell me about your longest intimate relationship. How did it evolve? How did it end?" Instead of asking their job title, you ask, "Can you trace for me the number of years since age 21 that you have spent gainfully employed and how you handled transitions between roles?"
You are hunting for patterns of resilience, adaptation, and the maturation of defenses over decades.
And there is a stark, somewhat humbling therapeutic reality check nested in this longitudinal view. Let's say you are treating a severely ill patient with schizophrenia, whose global assessment of functioning score is currently a 40. They're actively hallucinating and struggling with basic hygiene.
As a psychiatrist, you can prescribe a powerful atypical antipsychotic like clozapine. And by forcibly correcting those biological neurochemical defects at the receptor level, you might successfully raise their GAF score from a 40 to a 70. The hallucinations recede, they can maintain a routine.
But how do you raise a patient's GAF from a 70 to a 90? How do you move them from stable to flourishing? You cannot do it with a prescription pad.
Chemicals can brilliantly alleviate the acute, debilitating symptoms of mental illness, but chemicals absolutely do not teach healthy brain function.
To guide a patient from a 70 to a 90, to help them achieve true Ericksonian generativity, to help them develop mature defenses like sublimation and humor, to foster deep subjective well-being that requires intense, sustained cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic education. It is an arduous, collaborative process of learning.
Dr. Vaillant equates it to taking a patient who is completely illiterate in the Italian language and through years of sustained, intensive, immersive intervention, teaching them to become a fluent, expressive Italian conversationalist. You are literally forcing the brain to build entirely new neural pathways through guided experience and hard-won insight.
That is a staggering, beautiful undertaking for any clinician.
All right, we have covered an immense expanse of clinical and philosophical ground today. Let's distill the absolute core takeaways from this exploration of normality. First, normality cannot be defined by any single metric, and it is certainly not synonymous with a statistical average.
Second, mental health is a highly active, dynamic state. It is defined by adaptation, resilience, and the pursuit of meaningful functioning in the face of inevitable friction.
Third, while cultural context absolutely shapes our expectations and diagnoses, ultimately, objective biology trumps shifting anthropology.
Fourth, the deployment of mature defense mechanisms, sublimation, humor, altruism, suppression, and anticipation is the active psychic alchemy of turning unbearable stress into healthy adaptation.
And finally, any clinical judgment regarding mental health must be fundamentally longitudinal. It must evaluate the long arc of a patient's life, weighing context, subjective distress, and functional impairment over time.
To solidify these concepts before you return to the wards or your reading, let's put your clinical reasoning to the test right now. We have designed a series of single best answer questions drawn directly from the mechanisms we've just unpacked. Listeners, I'm going to read the clinical scenario and the options. Take a second to actively lock in your answer before we break it down.
Let's do it. Question 1. A clinician is observing a patient facing a highly stressful, inevitable life transition. Which of the following involuntary defense mechanisms involves consciously keeping an effective response to an unbearable future event in mind, strictly in manageable doses, in order to master the internal conflict before the event occurs? A. Repression. B. Sublimation. C. Anticipation. D. Projection.
You have a moment.
The correct answer is C. Anticipation. It is the vital work of emotional preparation and anticipatory mourning for future pain. This contrasts sharply with repression, which unconsciously buries the effect entirely, or projection, which defensively throws the internal conflict onto another person.
Question 2. In Adolf Meyer's foundational concept of mental health, involuntary homeostatic mental mechanisms, what we call defenses, function to shield individuals from sudden, overwhelming changes in 4 specific domains known as the lodestars of conflict. Which of the following is not one of those 4 lodestars? A. Social learning or conscience. B. Cognitive intelligence or IQ. C. Impulse, affect, and passion. D. Reality.
Have a think.
The answer is B. Cognitive intelligence. The four lodestars that constantly grind together to generate intrapsychic conflict are our raw impulse, the unyielding external reality, the people we are attached to, and the social learning or conscience we have absorbed. IQ is a cognitive capacity, not a primary source of conflict generation.
Question 3. Consider this clinical presentation. A 28-year-old elite athlete severely fractures her leg and is temporarily unable to compete, leading to a brief 2-month period of mild depressive symptoms. In the next room, a 30-year-old individual has a lifelong diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, but currently presents with perfectly normal blood sugar levels due to strict daily insulin adherence. The athlete's current depressive condition represents a blank, while the diabetic's underlying physiological condition represents a blank. A. Trait state. B. State trait. C. Mechanism manifestation. D. Pathology, normality.
Lock it in.
The answer is B. The fractured leg and resulting transient mood dip is a temporary state. It will resolve. The diabetes, despite the currently normal cross-sectional presentation, is an enduring, lifelong trait. Recognizing this distinction is paramount in psychiatric diagnosis.
Question 4. Neurobiological research into positive prosocial emotions, such as profound trust, empathy, and moral judgment, indicates high metabolic activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. What specific type of neuron, which is vastly more numerous in adult humans than in higher apes, is highly concentrated in these exact areas and linked to the governance of social emotions? A. Purkinje cells. B. Spindle cells, also known as von Economo neurons. C. Glial cells. D. Motor neurons.
Pause for a second.
The answer is B. Spindle cells. Humans possess nearly 200,000 of these complex neurons, compared to a mere 7,000 in chimpanzees. This massive proliferation highlights that positive mental health and complex empathy are hardwired evolutionary achievements, not just cultural side effects.
Question 5. According to longitudinal studies examining subjective well-being, or SWB, and the psychological concept of the hedonic treadmill, what is the typical, statistically verifiable long-term outcome for individuals who experience a massive, sudden, euphoric windfall, such as winning a multi-million-pound lottery? A. They sustain a permanently elevated, lifelong level of high SWB. B. They experience a permanent decrease in SWB due to sudden social isolation and paranoia. C. They return to their previous baseline level of SWB within a matter of weeks or months. D. They rapidly develop intermediate defense mechanisms to cope with the sudden influx of wealth.
What do you think?
The answer is C. Due to the powerful homeostatic mechanisms of the human central nervous system, they rapidly adapt to the novel stimuli and return to their original baseline of subjective well-being.
Question 6. A psychiatrist is conducting an initial intake assessment of a 50-year-old patient. Based on the principle that mental health must be evaluated longitudinally, which of the following questions provides the most valuable, robust data regarding the patient's objective, adaptive mental health? A. Are you currently feeling overwhelmed or anxious at work? B. What is your exact present job title and salary? C. Can you tell me how many years since age 21 you've spent gainfully employed? D. Are you currently legally married?
Final thought.
The answer is C. Can you tell me how many years since age 21 you have spent gainfully employed? This question assesses the patient's enduring capacity to sustain work, tolerate interpersonal friction, and adapt to changing environments over 3 decades, which is vastly more informative than a cross-sectional snapshot of their current mood or marital status today.
Outstanding. As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative reflection to chew on. We discussed the neurological fact that the human brain continues the physical process of myelinization, insulating its pathways for faster, more complex processing well into our 6th decade of life.
Think about what that actually means.
It means that mental health is not some static, fragile plateau we achieve in our physical prime at age 25 and then spend the next 50 years desperately trying to defend against the ravages of time. It is exactly the opposite.
Mental health is a lifelong, active, biological, and psychological pursuit of adaptation. The brain is literally physically wiring itself to support deeper wisdom and more mature defenses as we age.
So look at the conflicts, the friction, the lodestars grinding against each other in your life right now. What grain of sand, what specific irritation, what pain, what seemingly unbearable conflict is sitting inside your psyche right now, just waiting for you to do the slow, involuntary work of sublimating it into a pearl.
It is the work of a lifetime. Here are the details of this episode.
Normality and mental health. Byline. Normality is not a fixed point. It is a moving balance between adaptation, resilience, and meaning. Episode description. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. What does it mean to be normal? This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Rather than defining normality as the absence of illness, contemporary perspectives frame mental health as a dynamic process, the capacity to adapt to internal and external demands, sustain relationships, regulate emotion, and pursue meaningful goals. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Statistical, cultural, and functional definitions of normality each offer partial truths. What is common is not always healthy. What is rare is not always pathological. Cultural context shapes expectations, while individual variation challenges rigid boundaries. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. A central theme is adaptation. Mental health reflects the ability to respond flexibly to stress, to integrate experience, and to maintain coherence of self over time. George Vaillant's work on mature defenses and adaptive functioning highlights that health is often revealed not in the absence of struggle, but in how individuals manage it. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Another key idea is that pathology exists on a continuum. Traits and behaviors blend into one another, and the line between normal and abnormal is often defined by distress, impairment, and loss of flexibility, rather than by the presence of specific symptoms. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Clinically, this chapter invites humility. Diagnosis is not merely a categorization of disease, but a judgment about function, context, and meaning. It reminds us that mental health is not static, it is negotiated across time, environment, and experience. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Key takeaways. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Normality cannot be defined by a single criterion. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Mental health involves adaptation, resilience, and meaningful functioning. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Statistical norms do not necessarily equate to psychological health. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Cultural context shapes definitions of normality and pathology. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Mental health and illness exist on a continuum. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Mature defense mechanisms are associated with adaptive functioning. This chapter challenges one of the most deceptively simple questions in psychiatry. Clinical judgment must consider context, distress, and impairment.